cabbage worms! They are my nefarious, sworn enemy, one of my very worst pests that I deal with in the garden every year. Now this year was weird because for whatever reason, the weather maybe, we had a very late cold snap, they actually didn't show up until just recently. So within like the last 2 weeks, and it's July, and that's very rare. Usually they are out and active the time that I put all of my brassica transplants out. So like early April usually. And usually they're eating up my tiny little transplants. This year I was actually able to get most of my crops harvested before they became a problem. But you can see in this late season stuff that's still left, they are making up for lost time. There are 4 main caterpillar pests of the brassica family. So the most common ones include the imported cabbage worm, the cross-striped cabbage worm, the diamondback moth larva, and the cabbage looper. So the most common that I deal with here are the imported cabbage worm and the cross-striped cabbage worm. And I will show you examples of both and kind of the damage that they do. Now it's pretty obvious once your plants get to this point that you have a problem, but you really want to catch these guys much earlier in the process. Here we've got imported cabbage worm, a pretty heavy population on these collards, and you can see when there is enough feeding damage going on that they almost skeletonize the entire leaf. So basically just leaving the midribs on these leaves and eating all of the tender green parts. And then we have the cross-striped cabbage worm on these kohlrabi leaves. And here you can see how the damage starts, which is you start to see these holes kind of eaten through the middle of the leaves. Now, one of the 2 signs that you can look for to identify cabbage worms of any type early on are the chewing holes in the leaves and piles of frass at the base of the plants. Now, frass is just a fancy word for bug poop, basically. But with cabbage worms, it is really obvious because of their diet. Their frass tends to be like a dark green little speckles, and it's easy to see. Sometimes in the beginning, easier to spot than the actual worms themselves. Fortunately, there are several very effective methods to keep cabbage worms from inflicting this much damage on your crops. The first is the use of row covers. You can use a lightweight row cover. There are a lot of different options out there, but the key with row covers is timing. As I mentioned, in a typical year for me, the cabbage whites, which are the adult imported cabbage worm butterflies, are out and active very early in the spring. You want to get those row covers on as soon as you set your transplants out or as soon as seedlings emerge from the ground to prevent the adults from laying any eggs on the plants. The other key is to keep them securely fastened to the ground so that there aren't any big holes or gaps where the adults can fly in under the covers. Another tactic is to encourage the natural predators of the cabbage worms. One of the most effective and lethal is the parasitic wasps. Now you can encourage their presence in the garden by planting plenty of things that they feed on. So they prefer the nectar from small flowers. So think cilantro, parsley, dill when it bolts and goes to flower, things like that. Other natural predators include shield bugs, ambush bugs, and birds. And in general, you can encourage these species just by keeping your plantings mixed and providing a little bit of something for everything. Rather than planting, say, entire blocks of just broccoli, if you mix it up with other species, with herbs, with flowers, that's a good way to bring in a lot of diversity to your garden. The next tactic is the use of trap crops. So you may have noticed in gardening that with certain pests, there is always a crop that they seem to prefer the most. And this is the case with cabbage worms as well. One of the most highly recommended trap crops for cabbage worms is collards. Now, the idea of trap crops is that you plant a block of the pest that you're dealing with's most preferred food source, in the hopes that you will lure them to eat that trap crop rather than the crop that you're trying to grow for food. So if I'm trying to grow broccoli, but I plant a trap crop of collards, the idea is that the cabbage worms will go to the collards rather than feasting on the broccoli. Now, with trap crops, you can either just let the crop grow and let the pest eat that crop and just stay on that crop. Sometimes people will actually prefer to let the crop get highly infested and then do something like use a flame weeder to burn the whole thing down. Sometimes use a BT spray, which will kill caterpillars, or other methods to destroy that crop and all of the caterpillars that are on it. Now, I planted a trap crop of collards this year, and while the cabbage worms definitely seem to prefer the collards, they're eating them down to just the stems basically, I still have a lot of worms on my other brassicas. So I'm finding that in and of itself, trap cropping is not entirely effective, but when combined with other methods, it's definitely useful. Another thing that you'll want to do is make sure to eliminate weeds around your garden that may serve as host plants for these pests. So that would typically be things like wild mustards and wild rockets, kind of again, anything in that brassica family, because if the cabbage worms have a large population of host plants, even if they are weeds, that's just going to encourage their populations to grow. And when you finally do put out your garden transplants, guess where they're going to go? Now, related to the idea of diversifying your plantings is the concept of crop confusion. So as I mentioned, not planting huge blocks of one single crop, breaking them up with other crops of other species helps cut down on the pest's ability to just have one giant smorgasbord. So think if you plant a cabbage here and a cabbage there and a collard over here, but in between those plantings you have things like cilantro or dill or wormwood or just basically anything that is not in the same brassica family. It won't stop the pests, but it will slow down their progress. And along with that, you can incorporate known plants that will repel pests. So things that the pests don't necessarily like. And this includes things like wormwood, thyme, marigolds, tansy, and peppermint. So if you notice in that list, it's a lot of very strong smelling herbs. But breaking up your plantings with these kinds of things, again, in and of itself won't get rid of your cabbage worm problem, but all of these things together will help to organically cut down on the pest populations that you're seeing in your garden. A relatively easy form of cabbage worm control is hand picking. So if your population is small enough and you just want to go out and check your plants every day or every other day, and you can squish the cabbage worms that you find, you can pick them off and throw them in soapy water, you can feed them to your chickens, anything to dispose of them. Now, the internet is full of wacky ideas, we all know this. One that I came across earlier this year was the idea of using decoys. The claim was that with imported cabbage worms, or the cabbage white butterflies, that they're territorial and they won't come and lay eggs on a plant where they already see a adult butterfly working. So you make these little decoys that look like cabbage butterflies and put them near your brassicas to prevent infestation from real cabbage butterflies. Well, I made a bunch of these and put them out early this spring, but since my cabbage whites didn't actually show up till almost July, I really didn't get an accurate reading on whether this was effective or not. Now it's an easy thing to do. It was worth a shot. If anyone has tried this and had it work for them, I would love to hear from you, because if it works, it's such a simple solution, but I'm kind of dubious as to whether it will actually work. And the final kind of last resort tactic that I will take if I really can't get my populations under control and they're destroying my brassica crops is the organic sprays. Now, there are several different products that will work on cabbage worms. My go-to is BT spray. So BT is a bacterium that is naturally occurring in many soils around the world. And you will spray your brassica crops with this. The caterpillars will ingest this and it kills them. In general, it's regarded as environmentally safe and it has no effect on non-target species. The thing to keep in mind with BT is that it is effective on all Lepidoptera, so it will also kill things like swallowtail butterfly caterpillars, monarch butterfly caterpillars, so you really want to be careful where you're spraying it. Now typically like a swallowtail is not going to feed on the same crops as a brassica pest, so in general if you're keeping the spray targeted to just your brassicas, you're not going to be killing off caterpillars that you may want to be keeping in your garden. Spinosad is another naturally occurring substance from soil bacterium, and is typically effective within 1 to 2 days of spraying. Now spinosad is toxic to honeybees until it is dry, so you absolutely want to avoid spraying when honeybees are active. Again, with the brassica crops, because they're typically not blooming when you're spraying, I don't see a lot of honeybee activity on or near the crops that I'm spraying. It's just something that you want to be very careful with. I've also heard that diatomaceous earth and neem oil will be effective against cabbage worms. I've not personally tried these, but if you have a lot of problems with cabbage worms, they may be products that are worth looking into. So if you are battling cabbage worms of any type in your garden, I wish you best of luck. And I hope that some of these tips help. And if you find content like this helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.